get started. So it may or may not be up, but those of you joining us in person, thank you for taking time out of this busy month to be here. We're super fortunate as a district to be able to work with Amanda Seawald this year. Some of you may have seen her program evaluation she did and presented to the school committee in December. She spent the first half of the school year observing in the classrooms. Some of you may have been at her meetings, meeting with all stakeholders and really doing a comprehensive evaluation of the Spanish Immersion program, where we're at and how, most importantly, we could move the program forward. So during the second half of the year, she's been in our classrooms, working with us on curriculum, instructional coaching, and it's truly been an amazing experience for us as teachers and administrators to be able to work with her, and just, she's a wealth of knowledge. She's worked with districts all throughout the Northeast, Southeast, different immersion districts as a consultant. She speaks Spanish, French, Japanese, so she really has a deep understanding of language acquisition. And she also advocates for world languages at a local level in her state of New Jersey, but also at a national level. She was recently elected the president of the Joint National Council for Languages. And she's really able to accomplish a lot nationwide for world language instruction. So we're super privileged that she's been working with us, and we wanted a chance to kind of share what we've been doing, how we're looking at instruction in terms of the Spanish language for Spanish immersion students, your children. So I will turn it over to her so she can tell you some of that.
Thank you, Katie. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight again, to have the opportunity to meet with parents, meet with more of you this time, and to have the chance to talk about the incredible immersion program here in Mendon-Upton. I have to tell you that, first of all, I want to thank Katie, I want to thank Olivia, and I want to thank Dr. Maruzczak for the opportunity to work with the teachers this year, to work with your district this year. I love this. I love your district. I love everything you're doing. I am so excited by the fact that this has such a history, this program, and how much you're able to do with it over time, and that you're ready now to take that next step of improving it as it grows. So what I want you to know here is that I've provided with you with some of the ideas that you're going to see here tonight. We'll also make sure that this is made available to you afterwards, and I just wanted you to have something that you can hold on to, post on your refrigerator at home, or whatever you want to refer to later. Who do we have here tonight? What age groups do we have? We have kindergarten parents, first grade, second, third, right, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. Anybody above seventh grade? Okay. So we've got a primarily elementary crowd here tonight, which is great because we're going to focus a lot on this concept of proficiency. Now, growing up in the United States, you probably took some language courses, and I'm sure that you learned in ways that are very different than the way your children learn. We know that for sure. Well, one of the things that happened over the last 15 to 20 years is that the American Council of Teaching of Foreign Languages developed standards that are based on measurable outcomes, where the terms fluency and bilingualism were never based on any outcomes. You couldn't determine how fluent you were, how bilingual you were. The new word is proficiency. It's not really that new anymore, but proficiency has measurable outcomes in different modes of communication. So what I want to do tonight is I really want to make it tangible for you. I want you to see what's happening in the classrooms, how we're using this to guide your students' growth linguistically, and what you can do at home and what the types of things are that you can look for at home to be able to assist your children. Sound good? Okay, great. All right, so did you plug me into something?
You plugged in, but we've got to grab a battery, so we're grabbing a battery.
So I'm just going to do this myself. Is that okay?
Just manually in the beginning.
That's
Yep.
right. Okay. So I want to start with this picture. Does anybody know what this is? This is Park Güell in Barcelona, Spain. I took this picture because it reminds me of exactly what happens in our classrooms every day. Every day we have a group of students coming from all different backgrounds, coming from all different experiences, with all different learning styles, with all different ways of taking in information, and with all different challenges. And every day we know that language learning has to take place in addition to content learning, but as a part of it. It has to all weave together. So when I look at this picture, it makes me think of all the things we have to put together, and that when we put it together the way we want to put it together, that it will create something beautiful and something that flows. The other thing that this makes me think of is something I hope that you'll remember tonight. Proficiency is not a straight line. It is not that one year they're going to be something and the next year they'll be the next level. That's not how you level up in language learning. Proficiency is an ongoing process and it doesn't always go directly from one place to the other. So I just want you to keep that image in your mind as we talk about this tonight. So what I'd like for you to do, this is the interactive part of the program. This is a piece of origami. And what I would like you to do to feel what it's like to have to think about how to interact interpersonally in the language, in any language, is I want you to tell the person next to you, have a conversation about what you think you would need to do in order to create this out of a piece of paper. Just take a moment to try and tell the person next to you. Tell each other how you would do this. Sounds awful, right? Follow the directions.
Follow the directions.
Get a piece of paper.
That's a good start.
Very optimistic.
Yeah,
I
that's
need
true.
about $1,000.
That's true. Practice pictures.
Don't make any folding errors.
So what are some of the things that you say right away? When you turn to the person next to you, what are some of the things you might say right away?
Fold it.
Fold it.
Follow the directions.
Follow the directions. Get a piece of paper, right? Start here. First you need this, then you need that, then later you need this. This is the type of logical connections of language that we're looking for our students to be able to use in communicative skills. And not only in writing, right? But specifically, and something that we're going to talk about a lot, is the way that we've worked on these interpersonal skills. You didn't know ahead of time that this is what I was going to ask you to do. You didn't have something written down that you could follow and read it out to someone, but you had to consider, what would I be able to say about this? Those are the skills, those are the most important interpersonal skills that will help your students, your children build proficiency, is when they're able to have spontaneous conversation. Does not happen overnight. Often these interpersonal activities must be scaffolded with sentence frames, meaning sentence starters, or question frames, questions that will guide their conversation. So for example, I would say, what would you, thank you. What would you do first? What would you do next? Or I need to. Some of those ideas are what we do in the classroom every day to make sure that your students have the tools that they need to have conversations. Any questions about that so far? Okay, great. Thank you for taking part in my experiment. But the big idea here is, why does proficiency matter? We're learning content. Why does proficiency matter? Because even though your students may be able to communicate about the American Revolution, they may be able to make a few statements about what animals live in which habitats. But are they able to communicate ideas when it's not contained within the content? Or are they able to communicate ideas about content that aren't things that they've read exactly? Right? So how are we connecting this to a more spontaneous conversational experience? We want to make sure that they're creating their own ideas, that they're solving problems, that they're using the language that they need to solve problems to grow their own proficiency. And that's where we're going with this. Of course, we wish that it could be this easy.
Road trip, buddy. Put some music on.
Welcome to Learning Spanish in the Car.
You gotta be kidding me. Yeah, this is good.
Vámonos.
Vámonos.
Gracias.
Trece horas en el carro sin parar y no traes música. Mira, entra y compra unas papitas.
Get up to 7.
Okay, so you get the picture, right? This is something that does not happen overnight. It's not easy to do, and it requires time, it requires attention to detail, and it requires really paying attention to these concepts of proficiency that I want to show you tonight. Some of you have seen that commercial, I'm guessing. They're great, they're wonderful commercials like that out there. So this year I had the opportunity, after conducting the evaluation, to work with the teachers and say, okay, where are we and where do we need to go? What are the challenges that we face and how do we address them? And the big ideas that came up for our plan are building proficiency guidelines, meaning looking at every grade level, every goal that we have, and comparing that to the actual standards for language development, and creating guidelines for what we want to see happen at the conclusion of each grade level. Remembering that the conclusion of each grade level is still going to be a different space for each of your individual students because of the way that language develops. Some may be very strong readers and their interpretive reading skills in the language may grow faster than other students. Some may be really interpersonal learners who love to talk and so they're constantly speaking in the language. And some may be really great at writing, and they may be more comfortable at using their writing and building their writing skills in the language faster. So the reason why proficiency is such a great tool is because it doesn't limit it by grade level or by age level. So that's the first piece. And this is all an ongoing process. Plan using the 3 modes. And I'm going to explain these 3 modes of communication to you. We've already started talking about interpersonal. I'm going to explain them to you because they are the key. As parents, and I'm a parent, as a parent, understanding these 3 modes of communication will be the way that you understand how your students are going to grow in the language and how you can ultimately support them at home. Focusing on the interpersonal mode, that's what we talked about just now, is how they're able to interact without necessarily having something written in front of them. It's not a prepared thing, it's more spontaneous. And developing an assessment map. And the idea of the assessment map is specifically proficiency assessment. Where are our students? What is the baseline for that? Where are we going with that? And how do we know how we get there? And there's a wonderful tool out there now called the Actful Apple exam, which we'll be using to do that and to follow through with that as the years go on. So let's look a little bit more closely at the concept of a proficiency pathway. And if you want to just look at this first page that you have in your handout, at the bottom left, you'll see this cone, right? That is the Actful Proficiency Cone. And at the bottom, you've got your novice low learners who might be able to say a word, right? Or answer in a yes or no question. If I ask a yes or no question, you could say sí or no, right? And then as you go up the cone, there's more that they can say and do in the language. Now this again is a very longitudinal process. It's not something that happens overnight. And it's connected to the Actful 5 C's. If you look over here, the Actful 5 C's were really the basis, they were the foundation for developing language education standards. So communication, connections, cultures, comparisons, and communities. The great news for all of you is that all of that is completely rolled into what's going on in the immersion classroom because of the content. The piece that is the most challenging in an immersion classroom is ironically the communication piece. Why? Because we know we have goals, we have standards for the content, but until this point, we haven't focused as much on what are the proficiency goals that we need to be reaching for the linguistic growth of our students. And that's really where our focus is. And to address that, we have these 3 modes of communication. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I want us to go across these 5 ideas. First, we're going to talk about a map, a pathway, how we get there, making sure we don't get confused, and what are the tools that we use to get there. And this is the way that I presented this to the teachers, so that the information you're receiving is exactly what the teachers received as well. So let's start with the map. You need a map to figure out kind of where you are and where you want to be. That is precisely what those 5 C's provide for us through Actful. They give us kind of a broad idea of what we want to do, and not only the 5 C's, but also the World Readiness Standards, which talk about these different ideas of what you need to develop in language in order to grow your proficiency. All of those are accessible online at actful.org. You'll see at the bottom the Actful emblem here, actfl.org. You can read all you want. You could be reading for days. So I've tried to water this down for you so that it is easier to do. Not because I think that any of you couldn't read all the Actful standards and go on and learn it all, but because it is very time consuming. And I want to make sure that you get the pieces that you need to make it most useful in your homes every day. So from the map, we want to say, okay, we're going to take this path. And the pathway that we need to take is one of proficiency. We need to look at this cone. We need to think about what it is. And I can tell you that in general, in world language programs across the country, high school world language programs in general, we traditionally in the United States, until the last several years, have graduated students at novice mid or novice high. That's pretty low, right? But that's because those weren't immersion programs. And probably many of you attended programs growing up where you were learning about X language in English, right? So your teacher often spoke to you in English and didn't speak to you in the language. That's what the result of that is. We know that the number of minutes in the language is directly correlated to how much your proficiency grows, which is why your students are in an incredibly amazing, opportune moment in their lives to be totally immersed in the language every single day. And what we see is that with an immersion program that begins in kindergarten and extends through their academic career, we see that growth so that most of them don't reach above advanced low, I would say, with the immersion programs across the country. And as the number of minutes changes, you know, we've got less time in middle school and less time in high school, that we kind of plateau somewhere here. It's good. It's still great. And still remember that even at an intermediate or intermediate high, or maybe even advanced low level, which we haven't determined where we're going to end up yet because we're looking at this, the breadth of what your students can say, because of their content knowledge, is different than any other students in the country. And that's a point that I really want you to take in. That what your students can talk about in the language is different than what most other children or young adults will be able to communicate in a world language ever. Another thing to remember here is the way that the Seal of Biliteracy is driving this growth. Have you all heard of the Seal of Biliteracy? Okay, it is a state initiative. It's actually happening all over the country, but Massachusetts has its own Seal of Biliteracy, and you have to reach intermediate high levels in order to obtain it in high school. So one of the goals is to make sure that all of our students get there, maintain it, and are able to test and be able to achieve the Seal of Biliteracy in high school. Then I think they put it on their diploma here in
It
the
is,
state
it's
of
actually an
Massachusetts.
imprint on the diploma.
In New Jersey, we have it's on the transcript.
19 kids meeting it for graduation in 2 weeks.
It's wonderful. Yes.
Sorry, what level did you say that
The law in Massachusetts, I believe, is intermediate high across all of the categories. So that
And then they also did, right, the Seal of Biliteracy with distinction, which is advanced low.
right.
Oh, okay.
So every state does it a little bit differently. That's something that at a federal level I'm advocating to adjust so that we have more consistency across the states. But this is the proficiency scale that we're looking at. Now you're saying, so what does this mean? Like how does this define anything? And what I want to show you is how we break this down. Inside each one of these levels, you have different levels, right? We have novice low, novice mid, novice high. Within those levels, there are basically indicators that help us see what your students should be able to do as they step up this scale. And that is across all three of these modes. So, for example, if we're going to look at this from as an assessment perspective, the ACTful Apple test helps us see what the different levels are, and they break them down. They show you that novice low is N1, N2, N3, N4. So this is the correlation. And the reason this is important is because at each one of these steps, there are different things your students can do to grow. Now I want to make that more tangible for you. So if you would open your packet and look at this page here that says interpersonal speaking, listening and speaking. What you'll see on the left are those Apple scores, N1, 2, 3, and 4, and I1. And you will see some descriptions, as well as some strategies. This is my favorite thing. As a parent and as an educator, my favorite thing that the ACTful Apple scores do is that they provide you with a strategy for how do you get to the next level. And that's something that you don't often see in educational materials, and I think it's so valuable. So just take a moment and look at these so that you can kind of grasp what we're talking about, and you can look at it and see where that puts them on these scales, just to have an idea. Now, this is just data that we're collecting as a formative tool. It's a formative tool. It is not something that's graded. It's something that is a formative tool because proficiency is not a graded skill. Proficiency is a developmental skill. It's a linguistic skill. And that's a very important piece to remember. What is great is your students' understanding of content. What you're looking at the school is how are they obtaining the standards. And of course, the standards in world language learning are more focused on their proficiency growth. And we're looking at other ways to demonstrate that growth in a more holistic way. So just take a moment and look at those. And if you have any questions, I'll take a question about it. You'll note that when you go onto the intermediate page, you see that the things grow. There's more that they can do. And you'll also see that from one level to the next, it's not that different. So it talks about consistency. It talks about how often they make errors. And it changes based on those little tiny pieces that ultimately provide the students with some guidance for how they grow. Any questions about that before I move on? Okay. So now I want to give you some tools that you can have in your house and think about and just look at and have a better understanding when you go back and you say, okay, so what did she say about proficiency and what does all this boil down to? If you look at the second page of your handout, this page and this are pretty much the same exact thing. They're two different representations of it, and I wanted you to have two different ones. Some people prefer these colors, some people prefer those. It's fine, either way. But what it does is it thinks about proficiency as a staircase, and I love this idea. I love this idea because if you think of proficiency, if you think of your own language learning, right? You remember how easy it was to get to that first level, right? Where you could say a word. You knew what that vocabulary word was. You knew how to answer it, yes or no, right? And then maybe you could say a sentence that was planned or was practiced. You could maybe ask a question, ¿Cómo estás? Something like that. But what we see in immersion education, as well as in world language education, is that we reach these plateaus, just like on a stair, right? On a staircase, you get to that first level, you get to that second level, but what we as educators need to be paying attention to, and what you as parents can help us pay attention to, are the risers on the steps. How do we get the students from point A to point B? And that growth often takes a lot of time in language education. It doesn't happen necessarily, certainly not from beginning of the year to middle of the year. It's happening, but the places where you can really measure it are over longer spans of time. Questions about that? Okay, and what you'll notice, and what I love about this, just like that Apple testing report, is that they have ideas here and here to show you how your student can go from one level to the next on this staircase. Okay? So now, we talked about our map, we talked about our pathway. Now I have to know, what is the vehicle we will use to get there? How are we going to make this happen in our classrooms? And that is the 3 modes. Now if you go back to your first page here, you'll see on the bottom right, I defined all 3 modes for you. They're pretty intuitive, right? Your interpretive mode means interpretive listening, interpretive reading, interpretive viewing, meaning watching videos, viewing information and listening at the same time. And also sometimes interacting with media, so maybe a website. But it's really a comprehension piece, interpretive language, right? So how that piece of language grows faster than anything else. Because you can understand a lot more than maybe you can write. You can understand a lot more than maybe you can say. And that's why the interpretive mode is usually our input mode. It's what we're making sure the students have. If you think about a robot, I always think about a robot when I think about this. A robot cannot do anything unless it's programmed first. Does anybody remember that 80s movie, Short Circuit? Johnny Five Alive? It's my favorite example of this. And Johnny Five Alive would walk around and say, need more input, need more input. That's exactly what your students need. They need more interpretive texts, more interpretive listening opportunities, more interpretive viewing opportunities to help get the information that they can then use to provide the output. So the input piece of the communication is interpretive. The second mode is your interpersonal communication. We're going to skip that for 1 second because I want to spend more time on that. But what I really want to talk about is your presentational. This is the one that probably when you learn languages, you did a lot of. Write a menu, right? Write a dialogue, right? Present something about the weather. Well, obviously you're not doing that here in the immersion program. Your students are doing much more amazing things than that. But remember that the presentational mode is a planned, prepared, spoken piece or a planned and prepared written piece. To keep in mind where accuracy matters is in presentational mode. Because when your students are speaking in the classroom, I will tell you, the teachers, not to correct them when they're having a conversation. Why? Because if you stop a student when they're taking risks and they're trying in the language, they're not going to try again. So what we want to do is we want to get them to just push it all out, make sure that they're able to say everything they can, and then we'll see how much they can grow. But in the presentational mode, what we're able to do is monitor their growth and help them edit their work, help them grow skills of accuracy so that their presentational mode skills grow. Okay? And that's the one that we're pretty familiar with. So now let's talk about the interpersonal mode. Interpersonal mode is primarily a spoken piece. The difference between interpersonal mode and presentational mode, anyone have it? It's interpersonal is more informal. What else? You have to be able to listen, right? What else?
Unedited.
It's unedited, it's not planned, it's more spontaneous. And when you're talking about young kids, you're saying, well, my kids don't have enough language to be able to spontaneously create language. The way we do that is we create scaffolded interpersonal lessons, right? So there might be certain questions that they have to ask each time they go to talk to someone, but then the responses might be different. And they might have to think about it a little bit differently each time. So the key for us as educators is to create these really neat experiences where they're interacting almost like they just met someone on the street. But they're interacting and talking about the content that they're required to learn in your classrooms. It's really an art. And I have to tell you that the teachers in this district are incredible at it. They are some of the most creative people I've ever met, and I'm thrilled to be working with them. But this interpersonal skill piece is the most important skill to build proficiency. Everything follows suit. Everything follows suit. If you're able to build proficiency in interpersonal skills, then the students have the confidence to try everything else. And the other two, interpretive and presentational, are also dependent on this. You'll see a lot more growth if you are building the interpersonal mode as well. Okay, so I want to quickly talk about can-do statements. Can-do statements are tools that we use to help students self-reflect. What am I able to do in the language? So they're in addition to the standards that we might have, but they match them, right? One of the things that we're working on and that we're hoping to roll out, in the next year or so, would be working on an opportunity for students to reflect on their own learning using the can-do statements in a portfolio type experience. And that's a very important piece as well. The teachers currently are building some of these can-do opportunities into their units as well. The other thing about can-do statements is that it helps make it more personal. Again, in a world language classroom, if you learned, probably you had those units all about me. I can introduce myself to my friend. I mean, that's not what your students have had. So we have to take a step back and give them opportunities to discuss themselves personally, to make it a personal experience, say what they can do some metacognitive discussion about it, which is great. And if we teach them to do that from the time they're young in the language, then it really will help grow their proficiency. To help us explain everything that I've said so far, I would like to show you a video from the American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages, which explains this whole concept of proficiency.
Learning languages prepares us to connect in the multilingual and multicultural world we share. ACTFL and 16 other language organizations collaborated to create the World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages. Recently, the standards were modified to focus on literacy, real-world applications of language, and 21st century skills. These standards serve as a roadmap to guide learners to communicate effectively and interact with global competence while participating in communities locally and globally. Supporting this vision are 5 goal areas, also known as the 5 Cs: communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. Integrating these goal areas into instructional programs helps students become world-ready educated citizens. Within the 5 Cs are the 11 content standards that describe the knowledge and abilities students should acquire throughout their language education. Let's take a look at the goal areas and the content standards. The communication goal is divided into 3 content standards describing the 3 modes or purposes of communication. The interpersonal mode for interacting with others and negotiating meaning, the interpretive mode for understanding and analyzing what is heard, read, or viewed, and the presentational mode for creating messages to inform, explain, persuade, or narrate. Each mode addresses how learners speak, write, listen, view, and use media, anytime, anywhere, with anyone. How can we measure student growth towards this goal? The World Readiness Standards include sample performance indicators that allow students and teachers to reflect on and track progress in all 3 modes of communication using can-do statements. These statements describe real-life applications of language, showing what learners can do at each stage from novice to intermediate to advanced. And now let's talk about the other 4 Cs. These outline what students do with the language and how they utilize it in a wide variety of contexts. In the Cultures and Comparisons content standards, students use the target language to investigate, explain, and reflect on aspects of language and how cultural perspectives influence our practices and products. In the Connections content standards, students build critical thinking and problem-solving skills, and they also access and evaluate diverse perspectives. In the Communities content standards, students use the language within and beyond the classroom, as well as set goals and reflect on their progress. And how can we observe student progress in these goal areas? The World Readiness Standards include sample progress indicators. Sample progress indicators are specific to student age and language level, acknowledging that learners' cognitive and maturity levels may not match their language abilities. This means that even though learners at the same proficiency level have similar language abilities, the tasks they perform with the language change based on their age, experience, and interests. In review, the World Readiness Standards are organized around the 5 Cs, with sample performance indicators for identifying what learners can do in communication, and sample progress indicators demonstrating a wide variety of applications using language. Combined, these elements show us what learners should know, be able to do, and how well they can do it. The standards help learners understand their growing ability to communicate effectively and interact with global competence, and provide language educators at all levels a clear roadmap to follow in order to guide their students to a place of world readiness. Visit standardsforlanguages.org.
So I hope that that helps a little bit to clarify. Sometimes I find that seeing a video about it helps us to understand. Me telling you the whole thing is not as helpful, right? But I wanted to make sure that we do both. I want to have you understand that what we're trying to achieve here is to give your students every opportunity to demonstrate what they understand, to grow in the way that they use the language, and to try it in different ways, to be critical thinkers, to be problem solvers, and to use the language to do that. The recognition that communication is a tool for problem solving is inherent in an immersion program because it recognizes the value of content. And that's what your students already have. The understanding of how to use that language and grow their ability to broaden what they can say and how they can compare and contrast and how they can identify ideas and speak more about them, to tell you more about something, that's where the proficiency comes in. And that's where we're really focusing. So you might think, well, my student walks into this class, and what are the teachers doing as we grow this proficiency, as we grow the amount of content that they're taking in, to make sure that they're not confused, right? Because it's easy to get confused, especially when they're thinking about a whole bunch of different things. Ironically, it's easier for us to get confused than for children to get confused. They take it all in, and they have a whole bunch of different things going on, and they can manage it. Multitasking gets harder when we get older. But these are examples of pieces of comprehensible input. This is an example in French, this is an example in Spanish. Comprehensible input means we're making sure that the tools that we're using are not only texts that are designed for our students, or that are hard for our students. Because often, some of the information about the American Revolution is not going to be designed for your 4th grade or even 3rd graders, right? What do we do with that? We have to find ways to make it comprehensible. We have to find ways as teachers to use the tools that we have to scaffold, to build a scaffold that allows our students to attain the information, but get it in a way that makes sense to them, that they don't feel overwhelmed by. So that's comprehensible input. So let's just go over this really quickly. What your teachers have been working on this year, what we've been working on together, is the ability to focus on proficiency. The ability to give the students a pathway to growing their language capability, in addition to and alongside of the content that they're learning. Those 5 C's help us with the concept of global reasoning. We're going to be doing a lot more with how we're connecting to global issues around the world, which is a great way of connecting this concept of community, this concept of comparisons, and using the Sustainable Development Goals to do that. The proficiency levels, looking at those defined goals and then taking each grade level and saying, okay, what are the things we can really reach in each of the modes for this? Because remember, you may be able to do a lot more. Your interpretive learning, again, could be much higher on that proficiency scale than your interpersonal learning, especially in the lower grade levels, right? When the students are not producing as much language necessarily as they are taking in. The can-do statements, helping to move the program in a direction to create student individual growth patterns and to help the students take ownership of their own learning. Comprehensible input. It's necessary or none of it matters. So we have to make sure that in each lesson we present, in each unit we create, that we're thinking of ways, what are the tools, the resources that we can use to teach these broader concepts that in another classroom might be easier to teach because the students have more command of language. But we have to find ways to make it more possible to be comprehensible. That requires use of visuals, that requires use of infographics, that requires use of all different types of tools to adjust lexile when necessary, and to make sure that the students have what they need to grow. It's our job to define how proficiency will play a part in the immersion program, and that's what your teachers have been doing all year, and doing an incredible job of, by the way. I've already been able to witness a couple of times that I've been here, seeing the teachers in every classroom, building lessons, building activities that take your students to focus on the interpretive mode, then to focus on the interpersonal mode, to focus on the presentational mode. I have to just share that, as an example, Senora Cardamon's class, just yesterday, we were there, I can't even remember what day it was. Yesterday, they were talking about the different states. They were studying the states in their social studies class. And something that she and I designed together was almost like a clue game, where they had a sheet and they had to find out some information about another person's state by having a conversation with them, and then try to guess, based on the information and the clues that they're gathering, what state that student represented. And it was not easy. And this was the first time they had done this. But I was amazed, I was truly amazed that not only, one of the things we learned from it, they didn't switch partners that often. Why? Because what was the great outcome from this was that your 4th grade students were able to have a sustained conversation in the target language about the content, asking questions and getting answers and growing their abilities in an environment that was created to help them learn the content. But what they didn't realize is that they're growing their interpersonal skills so much by doing that, right? Another example that I've seen in classrooms is the use with the younger kids of the idea of like headbands or, what's the one that Ellen does? Heads up, where the students have to come up with ways to circumlocute to get their friends to guess a word that they've got in their head. These skills, the skills of comparison and contrast and broadening that, the skill of asking questions, not answering questions, but asking your own questions, and the skill of circumlocution are 3 of the most important skills that your students can develop to grow their proficiency. Makes sense, right? The more you can, the broader the comparison and the contrast, the better. The more you can say about it. The bigger the questions, the bigger the ideas, the more your students can turn ideas around and ask questions, the better. That's why we love Jeopardy, right? Jeopardy makes us think differently. It makes us turn our thinking around and turn something into a question. And what about circumlocution? Circumlocution is the example that you think of when you're giving students vocabulary lists, or in any class. If they're able to define the word with a whole bunch of other words, then they have all of those words at their disposal. And to be able to do that in the target language demonstrates a whole new level of proficiency. And those are the skills, those are the hard skills that we really need our students to develop. Any questions so far? Okay. So, I just want to go over those 3 modes, because this is really the crux for us. What we've focused on is this idea of planning, instructing, and assessing across the 3 modes, and repeating it again and again and again. Using those 3 modes, getting the students to understand that they're learning across these 3 modes, and showing their skill development through that. So what are the tools that we use to get there? One of the tools that we're using to get there, to get ourselves to an understanding of how our instruction and our planning are playing out, how the proficiency is growing, is the ACTFL Apple assessment, which we will be piloting in the schools this year with a few different grades. We'll be looking at this from the perspective of how is our proficiency growing across the modes. The students will take this test in different areas. They're not all going to take interpretive, interpersonal, presentational, because obviously your younger students can't do presentational writing yet, right? So what we're trying to do is look at how this Apple assessment, which is created by ACTFL, is going to help us get a baseline for where we are with proficiency, and how we can design now what the proficiency guidelines should be at each grade level based on what we know our program offers. Right? That means you have 100% K through 2. The students have 80-20 in 3rd grade and 60-40 in 4th grade, and then it reduces in 5th and 6th grade and 7th and 8th grade. And so how does that impact proficiency? How do we maintain and sustain proficiency? And then, of course, how do we then grow it? And all of this we can get by starting with a baseline of an assessment in proficiency. Again, these are the domains that each of the novice, intermediate, and advanced ranges cover. So it's the domains of the domains, the functions, the context of the content, and the text type. These are some of the different areas that they focus on the tests. Understanding that these tests are designed to be interactive. It's the greatest, there's no, like the standardized tests the kids take are awful, right? But I have to say that the Apple assessment's actually kind of fun because of the way that it's designed to make you feel like you're interacting with someone on your computer. It's great. And the idea of the Apple test, and actually I was involved when they first started to develop the Apple test, and the idea is performance towards proficiency, meaning you're performing on this particular, in this particular instance in a way that demonstrates that you can independently continue and consistently use the language at that level, right? Proficiency is more about what happens when we plop you down in the real world. How do you use language? So I just wanted to share with you, so the state of Utah has a statewide dual language immersion initiative, and they have for many years. They have many different languages that are used, K through 16 now, so they have students who bridge from high school into the colleges, taking courses at the college level, both in the high school and when they reach the universities. And they have a very well-developed system for assessment. They use the Apple exam as well. And the way that they've done it, because the Apple is designed for 3rd grade and up, I just want to make that clear. So K through 2 would not be taking the Apple because it's not designed for students that young. 3rd grade and up, the way that they've decided to do it is to test speaking, meaning interpersonal speaking, at 3rd grade, but not test the other areas. And then the next year, they reverse it. And they do that as a pattern across through 9th grade. They reverse it back and forth. That may or may not be the way that we choose to do it. Every district that I've worked with that has an immersion program chooses to do it based on who their students are, what the number of minutes are, what the development is like, and how the program grows. And so those are the decisions that we'll make here based on your program, based on your students, and what the experts who are your educators are able to tell us about your students. Another thing I wanted to point out, because I know often as students get to high school they think about this, is how these actual measures and how these actual levels connect to the AP exams at the high school level. So if your students can get to the intermediate mid-level, which is definitely going to happen, then getting a score of a 3 is certainly attainable AP. We know that most of the universities accept it at 4 or 5. That's what most universities do. And of course the goal is to reach at least that intermediate high so they can get not only the Seal of Biliteracy, but also potentially receive a 4 or 5 on the AP exam. But I want to just say that honestly none of that matters. Parent to parent, I just want to say to you, what matters is that those students, that your kids are going to be able to go out into this world and communicate with other people. And not only in Spanish. I want to say this, I think that because you have this, you're so lucky that I think sometimes we don't see what's still going on when people don't have it. What I want to say is your students have an ability to think about the world differently than other children. They have the ability to go out into the world and even in a language that they don't understand, think about ways to communicate. Understanding proficiency will help them do that. Understanding the way that we learn language, the way that we communicate when we don't understand something is another tool that they can use. It's a cognitive tool in addition to a linguistic tool. So again, these are the keys. These are the keys. And when you go home and when your students are home, these are the things that you might want to have them practice. Can they ask, obviously, you want them to try and stay in the target language. Give them opportunities to practice target language things. Anything that you have that puts them in a situation where they can speak with someone in the language or use the language by listening is a great opportunity. The other key is to get your students to ask questions. I tell teachers this all the time. Instead of having your students answer questions on a test, give them a reason and ask them to write a question about it. That is a process. That is a process that is so important in proficiency development. Broaden comparisons and contrasts. Give them bigger comparisons. Make them think about how things are different from one country to another, from one house to another. Give them the opportunity to do that at home, to think about how things are different and the same. Teach, model, and practice circumlocution. I ask teachers to even come up with games that focus on circumlocution because that is ultimately what's going to help them. If you see your student coming home and trying to look words up in English, that's great, but make sure that they are trying to understand how they could describe it in Spanish. That's what you want them to be able to do. And it's not so much about saying, what did you learn today in school? What can you tell me in Spanish? Or translate this for me, or interpret this for me, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that we make this mistake of thinking, okay, my kid can speak this language, or this person can speak this language, so they can do simultaneous interpretation and translation. Interpretation and translation are both professional skills that require certificates. None of our kids have that, so that's not the way to approach it with them. The way to approach it with them is to give them the opportunity to describe things. Give them the opportunity to take what they know and show you how they can work around it. To come from pictures and look at pictures and try to describe things that way. Think about things they're learning and tell you what it means by using language that they've practiced in school. Talking around words is one of the best things that your students can do, and that's a great thing to do at home. And the greatest thing that you do here in the immersion program is you give them something to talk about every day. In social studies, in science, and in math, all of the different things that they're doing depending on the grade level, they are able to really talk about things, talk about really meaningful ideas. And that's ultimately what I've been thrilled to be able to help them practice. that ultimately is what will give them this caja grande, this giant box of treasure and ideas and strategies that will ultimately lead them to be able to reach their proficiency goals and yours for them. I am thrilled to have been here with you, and I want to just take a minute to talk to you about this next step that we're taking. We're talking about how we make global connections to everything. Have any of you heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? I'm thrilled to see people shaking their heads yes, right? Because this is great. By 2030, the UN and many countries around the world have committed to achieving these goals. Not just educationally, but we're talking that countries are committing resources to achieving these goals, working collaboratively to make that work. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a great connection for your students. Think about it. Just take a look at these and think about the science and the social studies that go right into this. You can see the connections right away. And you can think about how getting our students to think in an inquiry-driven manner is perfect for this. This is a perfect way to create that opportunity for your students. These are the AP Global themes. So the AP exam that the students take often in high school, these are the themes. Does it look familiar? If you look at those themes, and then you look back at this, they're completely connected. This is the one gift from the College Board that keeps giving. It's a good gift. Because these ideas help our teachers all over the country really come up with ideas. Unfortunately, in the past, this was given to the AP teacher and said, have at it. 1 year, you've got to teach them everything. That doesn't seem very fair, right? What we've realized over time is that it shouldn't be that way. These ideas can start as early as kindergarten, right? These concepts can be things that we roll into what they're already doing. And of course, when you get to middle school and you're talking about alienation and assimilation, when you're talking about concepts of beauty, when you're talking about all of these different possibilities, discoveries and inventions. Today we were talking about how in the middle school immersion program, we can really get them to think about how inventions and innovations can assist with some of these global goals. And to get our students talking that way is to get them thinking that way. And to get them to think that way in the target language, your students have tools that can literally change the world. So I want to leave you with some pictures that I took this week in the classrooms. I had the chance, again, here's the clue game that we did in Sierra Cardamon's class, 2 pictures of that. These are the kids playing heads up in the first grade classroom. First grade, and they stayed in the target language the entire time. It was incredible. And here's a student reading with such beautiful fluidity in the 3rd grade classroom. It was gorgeous. It was such an exciting week for me. It was such a fun time to be here. I was here last month. I saw incredible growth. I see it every time I'm here. I think that you are blessed to have these teachers who are diving into this. They are taking what they're doing every day, which is non-stop. Let me tell you, this content is no joke. The content that they're responsible for is no joke. But to take that on and then to say, okay, now we have to focus on how we're going to work on this content and incorporate the growth of proficiency. And that's really what matters. So thank you so much for giving me your time tonight and for giving me the opportunity to work with your district. Thank you all for being here. Anything you want to say?
No, I'm good.
Okay, great. Thank you for being here. I'll stay around if anybody
If you
wants
want to
questions.
take an extra handout for anyone